The data is in. It's been a month officially as of today for this new presidential term. And what the data says, sort of broadly, bottom line, is that the country kind of hates this guy. I shouldn't say hate. It's not the right word. It's not a nice word. Maybe it's can't stand him. Or maybe I shouldn't characterize it at all. I'll show you the numbers. I will say we probably should have seen this coming. I didn't necessarily believe that it was coming this far, this fast, but, right out of the gate, Gallup did polling just after the inauguration. They did their first poll on public opinion of Trump in this second term, starting immediately after the inauguration. Literally, they had their first poll in the field the first full day Trump was in office, the day after he was sworn in. That is the definition of the honeymoon period, right? That's when you are at your high watermark in terms of what people are expecting from you and hoping for from you. But in that first Gallup poll of this presidential term, sort of shockingly, Trump was already underwater. In his first week in office, more Americans disapproved of him than approved of him. I mean, only by 1 point, but still, that's unheard of. That's a more than unusual thing in presidential polling. Gallup, in fact, said at the time that in the 70-plus years they have been doing presidential polling, Donald Trump is the only president for whom his approval ratings were underwater right at the start of his term in office, meaning more people disliked him than liked him. So in that first week Gallup poll, Trump was underwater, 47 approving, 48% disapproving. So that means he was coming in at -1. And like I said, that was something we haven't seen with any other president. And to me, actually, it was shocking enough that I didn't think it would stand. I thought that would be sort of an outlier. But now look at this. Gallup just did its follow-up poll, now 1 month into Trump being back in office, and his numbers have gotten worse. He's not -1 anymore. Now he's -6. Which makes him, at this point in his term, not only the most disliked and unpopular president in 70-plus years of Gallup polling, Gallup says it actually puts him 15 points below the average polling for presidents, again, over the last 72 years in which they have been doing this polling. At this point in a presidential term, 1 month in, the average is 15 points higher than where Trump is right now. Nobody has ever started off a presidential term this poorly in the eyes of the American people. I mean, all presidents are above water at this point in their presidencies, right out of the gate. Trump's the only one. Trump was underwater with the American public from day one, and since then, he's been sinking like a cinder block in an ocean trench. I did not know to expect that. To be fair, part of the reason I'd expected that Gallup number might go up and not down is because Gallup's not the only game in town. There were other national, well-regarded quality polls that came out right at the start of Trump's term that did show him in positive territory. Not big positive territory, but still positive. Like, for example, the Quinnipiac poll, which came out in late January, right after Trump was sworn in. It showed Trump doing okay. I mean, not great. But in that poll, he was above water. He was +3. But now, though, again, 1 month in, that same poll, Quinnipiac, it's flipped. He has gone from +3 in his first week in office to -4 now. That is a quick turnaround for a poll that initially looked okay for him less than a month ago. It looked okay for him. Now it looks terrible for him. Why is that? Well, it's because Trump's been doing stuff. And what the data shows is that almost every single thing he has done is soundly and clearly, and in some cases, wildly unpopular with the American people. Again, just look at that Quinnipiac poll that shows Trump underwater right now. More Americans disapproving of him than approving of him, right? He was +3 right after he got sworn in. Now he's -4. You can see in the internals of that poll a little bit about what's driving that. Do you approve of Trump's handling of foreign policy? No. Do you approve of Trump's handling of trade? No. Do you approve of Trump's handling of the federal workforce? No. Do you approve of Trump's handling of the Russia-Ukraine conflict? No. Do you approve of Trump's handling of the Israel-Hamas conflict? No, 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 no. Do you approve of Trump's handling of the economy? No. No, the American public does not approve of his handling of the economy. And stick a pin in that one, because that one's interesting for a number of reasons, and we will come back to that. But you take a look at the broad areas of responsibility a U.S. president has. And on all these broad points, the American public just says, no, Donald Trump, we do not like the way you are handling any of these issues. And then when you drill down, not just to, you drill down from the broad categories of things to instead the stuff he wants you to focus on, the very specific things he's done, his signature specific issues and his signature gambits thus far since he's been in office, the stuff that he thinks makes him look great. Well, those things are even worse than the broad categories. On those things, the stuff he's doing is catastrophically unpopular. I mean, look at this. This is from the same poll. Do you like Donald Trump's genius idea for Gaza? By a 40-point margin, the American people are against Trump on that. How about DEI, which they've tried to turn into a slur? Do you think policies focused on increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace are a good thing? The American people say, yes, actually. Yes, actually, we do think that's a good thing. By a 15-point margin, Americans are for that. How about tariffs? Donald Trump's favorite thing, right? Do you think Donald Trump's tariffs will help the U.S. economy or hurt it? By an 11-point margin, the American people say his tariffs will hurt the American economy, not help. How about Vladimir Putin? All right, this is one of the most important things that Trump has done since being back in office. You know, Trump's sitting there in the Oval Office telling reporters, yes, I trust Vladimir Putin, as he throws out 70-plus years of our post-World War II alliances and decides that now we're going to be allied against Europe and with Russia, all because he trusts Putin so much. Well, Quinnipiac polled on that specifically. Quote, do you think the United States should trust Russian President Vladimir Putin or not? 81% of the American public says not. Not. But Trump does. The same national polling shows the American public do not approve of Elon Musk. Individually, Elon Musk's approval is -12. But everybody else in his government is underwater. The American public has apparently seen enough already to be against, to be disapproving more than approving of not just Elon Musk by a mile, but Trump as well. And also J.D. Vance is underwater, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the brainworm podcast guy who's now U.S. Health Secretary, and Tulsi Gabbard, who really is the Director of National Intelligence, believe it or not, and Kash Patel, who was confirmed today as FBI Director. All of them are underwater in the new polling. The American public does not like any of them. Not a single one of them is above water. Nobody who they polled on is above water in the Trump administration. And it's not just Quinnipiac. Look at the polling on Elon Musk in the new CNN poll that's out today. By a 2-to-1 margin, Elon Musk having this prominent role in the administration is seen by the American people as a bad thing. 2-to-1 against his prominent role in the administration. In the new Washington Post poll, which we're going to talk about in a second, they've got an Elon Musk question as well. Are you concerned about Elon Musk in his government role gaining access to your personal data and information? The American people say, yes, yes, we are concerned about that, by a 29-point margin. Elon Musk being somehow empowered to shut down federal government programs, is that a good thing or a bad thing? By a 2-to-1 margin, the American people think that is a bad thing. In today's CNN poll, overall, Donald Trump is underwater by 5 points. In the new poll from Pew Research, Donald Trump is underwater by 4 points. In the new poll from Reuters, Donald Trump is underwater by 7 points. In the new poll from the Washington Post and Ipsos that's out today, they've got Trump underwater by 8 points. All of this absolutely historically unprecedented. No president has ever come out of the gate with numbers like this ever before. And it is across the board. But, you know, on that Washington Post one, look at this. Look deeper into that. They've got a -8. Look, the proportion of Americans who are strongly for him is 27%. The proportion of Americans who are strongly against him is 37%. So yes, your perception, your anecdotal perception is correct. He does have a small, fervent base of support, but the base of fervent opposition to him is much larger, like 10 points larger. The same poll also asked, do you want the next Congress, the Congress that's going to be elected next year in the midterms, do you want that Congress to be controlled by the Democrats to act as a check on Trump, or do you want it to be controlled by the Republicans to support Trump's agenda? By a 13-point margin, the country says, Democrats, please. We would prefer the Democrats to be in charge in the next Congress. In the Washington Post polling, do you support Trump banning transgender people from the military? No, by 11 points. Do you support Trump laying off large numbers of federal workers? No, by 19 points. Do you support Trump shutting down USAID? No, by 21 points. Do you support Trump pardoning people convicted of violent crimes related to the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021? Do you support Trump's pardon of people convicted of violent crimes on J6? What do you think the number is going to be on that one? The answer obviously is no. The American people do not support that. But the proportion of Americans who say that is 83%. That was his first major act upon taking office as president. 83% of the public disagrees with it. That's a bad plan in politics.
So clearly a lot happened today. We're going to get into all of it over the next hour. But I want to start 11 years ago this month, after Ukraine's parliament voted unanimously to remove the country's pro-Russian president from office. Vladimir Putin's forces invaded eastern Ukraine with a force known at the time as the Little Green Men, and claimed that part of Ukraine was actually a part of Russia. You probably remember it, and I remember it well because I was the spokesperson at the State Department at the time. I also remember well Republicans being quite united in their opposition to Putin's aggression and vocal about it. They were also pretty united in their anger they felt and vocalized toward Democratic President Obama for doing what they felt was not enough to help the Ukrainians. And one of the Republican senators who stood up at that time to make the case very passionately to Americans about why they should care enough about aid to Ukrainians to have it delivered was someone you may recognize.
And we should always stand on the side of the vulnerable and the oppressed. Vladimir Putin's recent invasion of Ukraine is a clear challenge to these principles. Some ask, why is this our problem? Well, because we cannot allow the precedent to be set that in order to engage the West in trade and commerce, smaller nations must first seek the permission of their more powerful neighbors. President Obama talks tough about Vladimir Putin, but his actions have not gone far enough to change Putin's calculation that the benefits of his aggression outweigh the costs.
And then, a few years later, when Senator Rubio had concerns that Donald Trump's first choice for Secretary of State wasn't sufficiently outraged at Vladimir Putin's behavior, he let him have it too.
Mr. Tillerson, do you believe that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are responsible for ordering the murder of countless dissidents, journalists, and political opponents?
I do not have sufficient information to make that claim.
Are you aware that people who oppose Vladimir Putin wind up dead all over the world, poisoned, shot in the back of the head? And do you think that was coincidental, or do you think that it is quite possible, or likely, as I believe, that they were part of an effort to murder his political opponents?
That was then, not that long ago. Senator Marco Rubio laying out the stakes pretty perfectly, I will hand it to him. Americans stand up for the oppressed, not the oppressor. We don't reward the aggression of violent thugs like Putin. Of course we don't. We raise the cost of that aggression, or we should. If there was one running theme, actually, to Rubio's career in the Senate, other than his desire for career advancement, it was his concern about Russia and Putin, who he called a criminal, a murderer, and an authoritarian thug who must be stopped. But then Donald Trump became president again, and he made Rubio the Secretary of State. And as a result, on Tuesday, Rubio, the former Russia hawk, was sent to Saudi Arabia to do Trump's bidding, sitting across from Russia's foreign minister, After, by the way, his boss had already made clear he was more than happy to give Putin all the Ukrainian land they wanted. And Rubio had to try to negotiate an end to Putin's war in Ukraine with Putin, but not with the Ukrainians.
The only leader in the world who can make this happen, who can even bring people together to begin to talk about it in a serious way, is President Trump. He's the only one in the world that can do that right now.
Quite a claim, the only one in the world. But even as Rubio was at that table, Trump was making pretty clear where his allegiances actually were. I mean, he called Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator without elections, falsely accusing Zelensky of starting the war in which Russia invaded his country. Just wrap your head around that. He claimed Zelensky was suspending elections because his approval rating was only 4%, which, by the way, is so far off. A recent poll showed Zelensky's approval rating was actually at 57%. Zelensky responded by saying that most of Trump's claims are Russian propaganda, adding, quote, "Unfortunately, President Trump is living in this disinformation space," an evergreen statement. But none of this shouldn't come as a big surprise, because all of this, the U.S.-Russia summit, Trump's ranting against Ukraine, all of it really comes just days after Trump had his first phone call back in the White House with none other than Vladimir Putin. Now, Trump did send his Ukraine envoy, retired General Keith Kellogg, to Kyiv to meet with Zelensky today. But then their planned joint news conference after the meeting was abruptly canceled, with basically no clear reasons given at all. So it's clear what Trump's idea for ending this war is. Reward the violent dictator who started it, and demonize the democratically elected president of the country that was invaded. And it bears repeating, when the U.S. faced a similar situation in 2014, after Russia invaded eastern Ukraine, took Crimea for itself, there was a huge caucus in Washington screaming at then-President Obama and the entire administration that they needed to provide lethal assistance, weapons, to the Ukrainians and be tougher on Putin. And it was dominated by Republican Russia hawks like Rubio and Senator Lindsey Graham.
If we do not decisively push back against Putin and make him weaker and all of our friends in the region stronger, the Iranians are going to misunderstand yet again we mean it regarding their nuclear program. So much is at stake. Putin's on the wrong side of history. He's on the wrong side of the law. Make him pay a price. The Ukrainian people are dying for their freedom. I hope we will stand with them, not just in words, but in deeds.
I mean, you heard him laid out clearly there. Graham said not helping Ukraine would put the U.S. on the wrong side of history, and it would send the wrong message to adversaries like Iran, which is very different from what he is saying these days.
Talking to the Russians separately, I'm actually okay with that. I think there's one person that Putin really is afraid of, and that's Trump. If you ever get a good deal on Ukraine, it'd be because Trump created a sense of dread by Russia.
I mean, what are they dreading exactly? Taking the land Trump has offered them? I'm not totally sure about that analysis. But this is what Republicans are doing now, going against all of their strongest convictions about America's role in the world, about the threat of Russia, the threat of Putin, to bend the knee to Trump. It reached a climax today when National Security Advisor Michael Waltz dodged some pretty straightforward questions from reporters about Trump blaming Zelensky for the war and about Waltz's own past statements to the contrary.
Who does he think is more responsible for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin or Zelensky?
Well, look, his goal, Peter, is to bring this war to an end, period. And there has been ongoing fighting on both sides.
You wrote in an op-ed in the fall of 2023 that, quote, Putin is to blame, certainly like al-Qaeda was to blame for 9/11. Mm-hmm. Do you still feel that way now, or do you share the president's assessment as he says Ukraine is to blame for the start of this war?
Well, it shouldn't surprise you that I share the president's assessment on all kinds of issues. What I wrote as a member of Congress was as a former member of Congress. Look, what I share the president's assessment on is that the war has to end. This is a president of peace, and who here would argue against peace?
Okay, so you do.
Turns out there's an op-ed for everything. That's how Republicans play the game now. The game of basically, how do I please our dear leader? The problem is, this is not a game at all. I mean, Trump is openly taking the side of a dictator against an oppressed American ally. Millions of Ukrainian lives are at stake, and that's just the beginning. this is having a broader impact on the world. It could have one. It gives Putin a green light to carve out a new empire, and he might decide that includes Poland or Latvia or Estonia, NATO allies that America is still theoretically sworn to protect. But what are those promises worth now? I mean, that's the other question. It's also a bad sign for our domestic politics. It's an indication of just how willing the Republicans are to go against their own long-held and publicly stated political convictions, to back Trump when he's at his most erratic and self-serving. And if they'll bend on this, what else are they going to be willing to bend on? Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he joins me now. Senator Coons, I just wanted to start by asking you, when you hear how Secretary Rubio and Senator Graham are talking about Russia now, given what they've said in the past, what do you make of that?
Look, I think you framed it well, Jen, which is that President Trump is the one who has made a dramatic departure from our previous positions as a country. And by suggesting that Zelensky is responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, by denouncing Zelensky as supposedly an illegitimate dictator, President Trump is completely reversing, standing on its head, the positions that my Republican colleagues have held for years. With the additional announcement this week that Secretary Hegseth is calling for 8% across-the-board cuts to defense spending for the next 5 years, I'll be interested to see how they turn themselves into a pretzel to somehow suggest that that advances peace through strength.
They certainly are becoming good at turning themselves into pretzels. I'll give them that. There seems to be this argument. You have sat at the negotiating table. I have been at the negotiating table. But they are making this argument that if you give Putin the parts of Ukraine he wants and also pull back assistance to Ukraine, that will put Putin in a tougher point of negotiation. That does not make any sense. But explain to us what you make of that argument.
So folks who are working for President Trump, who is allegedly a great deal maker, I think he wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, ought to go look in that book and see if there's anything in there that suggests the best way to negotiate is by giving away your major points right up front. Obviously, this isn't how Trump and Hegseth and Waltz should be negotiating with Putin. Putin is a murderous thug. He's a gangster and a KGB agent, and they all know it. And the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, worthy of the fierce sacrifice of the many Ukrainians who have fought and died to recover their sovereign territory from Russian aggression, is to stand toe-to-toe with Putin and threaten to increase sanctions on Russia, threaten to send more weapons, not less, to Ukraine, and lock arms with our European partners who have already spent more than we have on Ukraine's defense and economy. If he did that, Trump would show that he understands how to achieve peace through strength. Instead, what he's doing so far is going to lead to chaos through weakness. And if he, in fact, abandons, betrays Ukraine, he will be the biggest loser of the 21st century.
Turning to some other big news for the country today, one of the most controversial and least experienced nominees for the FBI was confirmed today, narrowly. The Senate confirming Kash Patel in a nail-biter 51-49 vote. That is because Republican Senators Susan Collins and Murkowski broke with the party, voting no, but in a pattern we've seen, not in a way that endangered the actual Trump cabinet member. Here was some of what we heard.
Kash Patel has shown that his loyalty lies not with the rule of law, but with Donald Trump.
Mr. Patel is a dangerous nomination that will make our country less safe.
We're talking here about a nominee who has an enemies list.
He is a yes man for President Trump.
If your plan is to destroy the rule of law and turn the Department of Justice into a political weapon that rewards loyalty and punishes dissent, then Kash Patel is the perfect person to lead the FBI.
People ask what Democrats are doing these days. That's some of what we're hearing, putting up a fight to the very end, trying to put pressure on this vote, which came down to one vote. Now, the FBI is here. It works alongside the DOJ, where a Trump prosecutor who has represented January 6th defendants says he wants to make inquiries into lawmakers' free speech rights and whether they've said things that he thinks threaten Elon Musk. Meanwhile, a judge did not block Musk's efforts to get into certain federal agencies. So some courts see some of this as lawful. They're trying to be fair and do it case by case. But as I've told you, we are seeing a string of court setbacks or outright losses for Donald Trump when it comes to trying to rewrite the citizenship clause of the Constitution, a big loss. 70 lawsuits now are trying to deal with various ripe targets in places that Trump and his team seems to have overstepped. Many executive orders are paused, awaiting further review. And Trump is asking the Supreme Court to help him out of a jam where he got a lower court loss about staffing. Now, what's happening here? I've told you there's a strategy, and I want to quote from someone else who has been tracking similar signals, a veteran federal prosecutor, Ankush Kordori, who notes that Trump is expecting these legal challenges and hopes they can change the longstanding principles of constitutional law with a GOP-stacked Supreme Court. It actually legally makes sense if you want to change the law or move it in a different direction, he writes in a new piece. And so to get into how this works, we are joined by Mr. Kordori, a former federal prosecutor who now writes about law for Politico magazine. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Great to have you. You're diagnosing something we've been reporting on the program. Trump is losing more often and more quickly than in the same first month of his first term and every other modern administration. That looks bad, but you argue could have a purpose because they also want to get past this stage and get help from above. Explain.
Yeah, I think actually the effort to go to the Supreme Court for the case that you just mentioned, the special counsel, head of the Office of Special Counsel, it's very telling, right? Because they want to get these cases to the Supreme Court as quickly as possible, thinking that they will win. But on almost all of these cases, certainly with the firings of things like the inspectors general, the heads of the independent agencies, the effort to segregate, impound, reallocate funds, delete agencies, in the words of Elon Musk, all of these things are violations of statutory law. Very clear violations of statutory law. I suspect that they know this. Their defense is going to be that the laws are unconstitutional, that they're unconstitutional infringements on the president's authority, which is an extremely aggressive agenda for anyone, much less this president, to be pushing on the Supreme Court. What he is proposing,
yeah,
when you take it all together.
Let me slow you down. I'm going to slow you down. You're so smart, you're so fast. Just on that stage, before we get to what I think you were going, which is his theories, this is different than not only most presidents, but as I emphasize, even in the first term, they had the more traditional view that losing all the time looks bad. They looked at it also for press and PR. There's all these headlines and discussions of losing. It reminds people of the limits on your power. So to use a sports analogy, we usually think of teams trying to win enough to get to the playoffs. This is a different strategy, right? They're trying to lose a lot and then get the Supreme Court to bail them out. So now please explain to us how that would work on that case you mentioned, firing IGs or other such clashes.
Well, the case that they're trying to take to the Supreme Court already, it's not even run through the preliminary stages below. So they're trying to expedite it extremely quickly. And I expect that they're going to attempt to do many of the same things with some of the other lower court decisions, once they get to that position, to move them out of the lower courts and the appellate courts, because not just Trump, but Musk and Vance, they have been trying to discredit these courts. And I think that's because they know that they're going to lose most of these battles, at least at the trial court level, in an effort to get this stuff to the Supreme Court and hope that they change the law radically in the president's favor.
Because honest trial courts apply the law as it is. And only the Supreme Court can honestly change the law.
Yeah, well, look, an honest trial court is going to say, well, you dismissed all these inspectors general, but there's a statute that says you have to give them 30 days notice and you have to explain it to Congress. That's a very clear violation of the statute. Judges are not supposed to be in the business necessarily of holding that statutes are irrelevant or easily or just casually holding that they're unconstitutional.
Yeah. So final question as we run out of time. John Roberts has talked a lot about independence over partisanship. Clarence Thomas used to issue rulings against the encroaching executive powers, seizing the line item veto and other things. What do you think is going to happen? How many of these folks are just going to go full MAGA on the court?
Well, look, I think Trump has a pretty good chance to get something, maybe not everything, he wants in the cases about the firings that may give him more discretion to fire people, including independent commissioners in the executive branch. I think he's going to have a harder time on the efforts to impound funds and to delete agencies, as Elon Musk puts it. And I think for there, you can expect the three liberals to object. And I would think you'd be aiming for Roberts and potentially Barrett to join them, maybe even Kavanaugh. And I think those are the major silos as we're looking at these cases going forward and the implications for the country.
Well, with Donald Trump sinking even deeper into the perversion of democracy by literally declaring himself a king yesterday, the news media is facing a challenge that it has never faced in the 236-year history of the American presidency: how to keep track of how many crimes the president has committed publicly, how many laws the president, who thinks he's a king and proclaimed himself a king yesterday, has violated publicly. In a normal presidency, the running count at this point is 0. And that usually remains the running count through every day of a normal presidency. Normal presidents do not publicly violate the law. I had a running tally going in my head for the first day or two of the Trump presidency of how many times he'd violated the law, but I, for one, lost track. And so today, with the help of a list compiled by the New York Times, we here at The Last Word, led by intrepid producer Stephanie Kovac, have counted at least 22 actions that appear to be violations of law, including violations of the Constitution, many of which have been at least temporarily blocked by judges. The New York Times list includes Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, accessing sensitive data systems at the Treasury Department, trying to dismantle the U.S. Agency for International Development, including by placing thousands of employees on leave, enabling agency heads to summarily fire some career federal employees without obeying civil service protections, Elon Musk overhauling the executive branch, blanket spending freezes, trying to end birthright citizenship, taking funds from cities that don't cooperate with the federal Trump immigration enforcement. The Washington Post reports today that Donald Trump is not fully obeying the orders of federal judges. Quote, federal judges have blocked President Donald Trump's attempts to freeze trillions in federal grants and loans, halt billions in foreign assistance, and dismantle the U.S. Agency for International Development. But in each case, the administration has said it still has legal authority to do at least some of those things, prompting judges and those challenging Trump's actions to accuse him of failing to comply. Legal experts said the administration's aggressive maneuvers have approached the red line of openly flouting court orders as Trump and his top aides and advisors assert vast presidential powers. Yesterday, Donald Trump asserted kingly powers, literally kingly powers, in a post on social media announcing his attempt to overrule local law in New York City that has successfully reduced traffic gridlock in New York City. Donald Trump said congestion pricing is dead in Manhattan. All of New York is saved. Long live the king! Exclamation point. President Donald J. Trump. Accompanied by this grotesque representation of a truly mad and imaginary king wearing a gold crown. Tonight, a federal judge ruled that Donald Trump is not fully complying with a court order blocking the freezing of foreign assistance grants and contracts. The temporary restraining order was issued last week by Judge Amir Ali. Judge Ali ruled, quote, the blanket suspension of congressionally appropriated foreign aid pending review had and would continue to cause irreparable harm, and that the blanket suspension was likely arbitrary, capricious, and under the Administrative Procedure Act. Donald Trump said last week in the Oval Office that he intends to obey rulings by judges. But so far, some judges don't think he's doing that. And into this lawlessness tonight steps the first FBI director in history whose Senate confirmation was publicly protested by United States senators.
When left to his own devices, Kash Patel has proven himself to be a wildly vindictive partisan. When around Donald Trump, Kash Patel has proved himself to be a sycophantic suck-up. Kash Patel, mark my words, will cause evil in this building behind us, and Republicans who vote for him will rue that day.
That was Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who last night on this program coined the term Trump servience to describe the breathtaking weakness of Republican United States senators. At the protest at the FBI headquarters today, California Senator Adam Schiff said this.
In the first Trump administration, as we are seeing in the second, you rise to the level of your sycophancy, and no one is a bigger or more dangerous sycophant than Kash Patel. This political hack does not deserve to be in this building. He can't do the job.
Only 2 Republican senators voted against the confirmation of someone who, before Donald Trump, would have won the votes of 0 senators from either party for FBI director or any other federal position. Republican Senator Susan Collins of Maine said Mr. Patel has made numerous politically charged statements in his book and elsewhere discrediting the work of the FBI, the very institution he has been nominated to lead. These statements, in conjunction with the questionnaire sent to thousands of FBI employees, cast doubt on Mr. Patel's ability to advance the FBI's law enforcement mission in a way that is free from the appearance of political motivation. Here's what Donald Trump's FBI director said he would do on the first day at FBI headquarters.
The FBI's footprint has gotten so freaking big, and the biggest problem the FBI has come out of its intel shops. I'd break that component out of it. I'd shut down the FBI Hoover building on day one and reopening the next day as a museum of the deep state.
Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska said, I have been disappointed that when he had the opportunity to push back on administration's decision to force the FBI to provide a list of agents involved in the January 6th investigations and prosecutions, he failed to do so.
He is a yes man for President Trump, already undermining the critical bureau he wants to lead, already demonstrating an alarming willingness to do the bidding of a vengeful White House.
On most issues, all elected Republicans in Washington bow in flawless Trump servience to Donald Trump, none of whom objected to Donald Trump calling himself a king yesterday. But once in a while, and just once in a while, a Republican senator sounds like what a Republican senator used to sound like back when Donald Trump was in the business of pretending to fire people on TV. It was Republican Senator Thom Tillis's turn to remember today what it was like to actually say what he thinks. On the Senate floor, Senator Tillis gave full voice to his disagreement with Donald Trump about Vladimir Putin.
Whoever believes that there is any space for Vladimir Putin in the future of a stable globe better go to Ukraine, they better go to Europe, they better invest the time to understand that this man is a cancer and the greatest threat to democracy in my lifetime. And it will be a cancer that spreads into the South China Sea, into Taiwan, and metastasizes across the globe. So, ladies and gentlemen, when I tell you that Vladimir Putin is a liar, a murderer, and a man responsible for ordering the systematic torture, kidnapping, and rape of innocent civilians, believe me, because the evidence is mile high.
Steve, why don't you've got charts on this? Set the scene for us on just how big the national debt problem is at this point.
Yeah, Mika, before we delve into the details of the House package, let's just remind ourselves and everybody just how bad this problem already is before we get to anything else that might happen. So here's the federal budget deficit going back to 2018, and you can see we were down here in the 500 billion to trillion range, and then COVID hits, fine, the deficit jumps up. We would all expect that, and that's what government's here for. It did drop down again, but now it is on this relentless rise, and these are projections, the green bars, going all the way out here to over $2.5 trillion of deficits a year. This is not how it is supposed to work. When things are relatively good and the economy is growing, we should be having a lower deficit and saving our firepower to use when we have a problem. That's not what's happening here at the moment, even before you get to any of the president's new proposals. That, of course, has led to a lot more debt. We now have over $30 trillion of debt. For the first time in our history, except World War II, we will have debt that's equal to 100% the size of our economy. It's gone up under Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, but the scorecard over the last 40 years, out of curiosity, is $14 or so trillion added under Republican presidents, about $12.5 trillion under Democratic presidents. So there are not clean hands on either side. And then given the size of those deficits, not surprisingly, the debt will continue to rise sharply and well exceed the rate of growth of our economy.
Okay, so if you could explain to us how the GOP plan would work, take us through the numbers.
So what the House approved yesterday is what, as you said, Trump likes to call one big, beautiful bill. It encompasses all of the things they're trying to get done. There are some various complicated parliamentary reasons why it actually needs to be in one big, beautiful bill, but whatever. So the signature piece of it, of course, are tax cuts, and I'll talk a bit more about those later, but up to $4.5 trillion of tax cuts over the next 10 years. And then spending increases, a few spending increases for their priorities. Judiciary and Homeland are both basically border-oriented spending. And then defense, which both parties, to a considerable degree, needs to have spent more on them. So roughly $300 billion more spending. But then they're talking about cutting a lot of spending. And so the Energy Commerce Committee is tasked with cutting $880 billion worth of spending. It's expected that that could be heavily out of Medicaid, could represent about 10% of our Medicaid spending. And so they're very focused on spending on Medicaid. But there's another guy who's not so focused on Medicaid. Take a listen.
Look, Social Security won't be touched. Other than if there's fraud or something, we're going to find it's going to be strengthened, but won't be touched. Medicare, Medicaid, none of that stuff is going to be touched.
Nothing.
You don't have to. Now, if there are illegal migrants in the system, we're going to get them out of the system and all of that fraud, but it's not going to be touched. We're going to love and cherish Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We're not going to do anything with that other than if we can find some abuse or waste, we'll do something, but the people won't be affected. It'll only be more effective and better.
So this wasn't a campaign promise. This is stuff he said since he's been president, contradicting what the House is doing. So it's going to be a very interesting process on Medicaid, which is obviously a very sensitive subject. And by the way, programs like Medicaid, like food stamps that he's talking about cutting as much as 20%, the House talking about cutting as much as 20% of, red states actually get a disproportionate amount of this money. So it's going to be interesting to see how Congress people hear what they hear in their districts and what they say. Student loans, another big target, could cut about 10% out of student loans. And then there's another $500 billion of unspecified spending. 62 of it would be what's called oversight. Those are federal pensions. So he's talking about cutting, they're talking about cutting $50 billion out of federal pensions. But when you add all this up, the administration, which says it's going to reduce the deficit, actually has a plan to increase the deficit by $2.8 trillion over the next 10 years. And so if you look here, this is the same chart we just looked at. You add in these new deficit increases, and you can see that instead of even dropping for a couple of years, it doesn't drop at all, and it just goes up further and further.
So lastly, Steve, you're going to show us how the GOP tax cuts favor the rich.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff in the tax part of this, and basically what they want to do. The central part of it is extending the tax cuts that were voted in 2017 that would expire at the end of this year. It was another bit of budget gimmickry. Would expire at the end of this year absent a renewal. But those tax cuts are what we call highly regressive, meaning they favor the wealthy substantially over the less wealthy. So people in the lowest 20% of the economy would get a 0.6% increase in their after-tax wages under this plan, and people all the way up through the 80% below the top would get still 1.4% or less. When you get up here, the top 20%, the top 1%, you see the percent increase they get in their after-tax income. Let's turn that into dollars. If you're down here, you're going to get $1,000. You might get $1,900 if you're close to the top. The top quartile gets $9,000. The top 1% gets an average of $70,000. So these are, again, what we call highly regressive tax cuts. Generally, we like to see them favor people at the bottom, not at the top. These are the opposite. The other challenge they're going to have, which is going to be a little bit fun if the stakes weren't so high, a little bit fun to watch, is that they've got this $4.5 trillion for tax cuts in this budget plan, as I said. Almost all of that will be consumed by extending these individual tax cuts that would otherwise expire. But during the campaign, the president ran around promising all kinds of other tax cuts. No tax on Social Security income. Restore the full deduction on state and local taxes. No tax on overtime. No tax on tips. Deduct in your taxes the cost of your auto loan. So he made all these promises. The whole thing adds up to about $7.8 trillion. So they're going to have to fit $7.8 trillion of promises into a box that's $4.5 trillion in size. And that's going to be an interesting push-pull between the administration and the Congress as well.
Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner with his charts and sound bites. Thank you so much, Steve. We really appreciate it.